Okay, good afternoon. Let's kick off. I can see that there's many more people joining, but the first few minutes are not the most interesting ones, so we better not lose time by waiting too long. A very warm welcome on this reasonably sunny afternoon today to our second conversation around the new vision for land use in Scotland, organised by the Scottish Ecological Design Association in collaboration with the James Hutton Institute. And as you probably know, because otherwise you wouldn't have joined today, we are going to be exploring new ways to manage Scotland's land. Many will agree that there is the need for radical changes in the way land is managed to be able to address climate change, loss of biodiversity, food security, prosperity and health and well-being of people living in working in the countryside, but I would say not just in the countryside, also in urban areas. And there's a lot of sort of talk about the need for change. There's maybe less agreement about the types of changes that are specifically needed. So this conversation is very timely. It also links nicely to a lot of Scottish Government policy initiatives, including the regional land use pilots, which are kicking off just about now, the regional land use framework that it's supposed to lead into that will be launched in 2023, discussions around land reform, discussions about various ways that the land sector can contribute to mitigating and adapting to climate change, and of course also the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow, the UN Climate Assembly, and also the UN Biodiversity Assembly, which will be taking place just a month before in October in Kunming in China. I am Marc Metzger. I'm a professor of environment and society at the University of Edinburgh, and I've been asked to chair today's conversation. I'm an interdisciplinary or perhaps even an undisciplined academic interested in understanding how we manage our land and how we make best use of the many benefits and nature-based solutions that we get from the land. And can the back office please show us slide number 1, which is a section of an illustration that I created a couple of years ago with some colleagues as a natural treasure map illustrating the many benefits that we get from nature. And many of these benefits are directly related to food and fiber, the soil and growth, the topic of today's conversation. But it's also important to understand that the benefits that we're talking about today, or the topics that we're talking about today, should not be seen in isolation. And there are many things on this map which may more closely link to other conversations that we're having. I do, however, very much welcome the focus on healthy soils, because soils really don't get the attention that they deserve. Globally, soils store 80% of all the carbon in our terrestrial ecosystems. And healthy soils literally underpin our food production in our forests. Mismanagements of soils is leading to carbon losses, to landslides, to loss in productivity. And so today's conversation will reflect on what we can do and how we can treat our soils with more respect to prevent further negative impacts and also to restore soil functions for future generations. You'll have seen that the conversation consists of 3 parts. We have our main speaker, Pete, who will be followed by 2 short responders. We have a discussion with an enlarged panel, and there's time for questions from the audience. And we have a large audience and a diverse audience. Currently, I see that there's about 200 participants, and it might even go up to a few more than that. And one of the things that I would be keen to understand is who exactly is in our audience today. Last week, some people asked for a participant list, which unfortunately we cannot share due to sort of privacy regulations. But I've created a short poll that maybe Gloria can get up. And in that poll, you can indicate which category best describes you. Now, it's always very difficult to do this, and you might fit into more than one category, or you might not agree with the exact labels that I've given. But could you please indicate whether you feel that you are a conventional or progressive land manager, another land professional, a policymaker, architect, researcher, or an interested citizen? And that will be interesting to see the response to know who we'll be talking to. So you can complete the poll whilst I talk through a couple of housekeeping issues. As you will have seen, your video and audio functions have been switched off. We're recording the event, and it's important that in the Zoom system, you give yourself a name that you feel comfortable with sharing to the general public out there. Others will be watching or reading the chats later on, so make sure that the name that you've given in the Zoom system is one that you're willing to share. There are 3 little dots that you can click, and then you can add your own specific name to the system. The chat box will be open throughout the event, so please feel free to use it and to leave whatever comments you want to leave, but make sure that they are polite and friendly comments. Again, this will be shared later, and it will be frustrating if we have unpleasant comments in there. And also the comments might be linked back to you, so you wouldn't want to have anything in there that others can read later that you wouldn't want the public to see. In addition to the chat, there's a Q&A function, and that is specifically to raise questions for later on in the session. You might receive some answers from our panelists during the event, but you can post questions there that are specifically for the discussion later on. So the organizers have worked very hard to move away from a sort of conventional presentation style event with lots of PowerPoint slides, and instead to have some moments of reflection with artists coming in to present some of their work that sort of links to what we're talking about. Also, we've been asked to use as few slides as possible, but we will have a few slides in there, a few illustrations. And then there are a couple of polls that we'll have along the way as well. I briefly saw the outcome of our current poll flash through my screen, but it's disappeared again. So here it is. So what we can see is that we, I mean, maybe not surprisingly, we don't have very many people who would label themselves as a conventional land manager, and more of them who feel that they are quite progressive. Quite a few land professionals, some policymakers, some architects and some researchers, but very interestingly, the largest group was actually interested citizens. And I'm quite pleased to see that, but it also means that we have to be careful not to fall into too much jargon. In the first session, certainly there was, it felt like we could play a land use jargon bingo with all the technical terms that we were using. So for all of us, let's try to use as simple language as possible to make the conversation accessible for everyone. So on that note, I'd like to start with the first prelude, our first artistic inclusion, which is presented or performed by Sue Ali. She's probably one of Scotland's most versatile and adventurous and charismatic cellists, but she has also recorded with Eric Clapton on her musical saw. And today we will also listen to a piece on her musical saw that she wrote or played during the lockdown. She stayed near the River Spey, and around midnight she went out and saw the moon, and that inspired this improvisation.
Hello, I'm Sue Ali, and I am sitting under the old Spey Bridge in Speyside. My feet are firmly planted in the Spey River, and I have found that during this self-isolation period, I've been up here now 8 weeks, and barely seen another soul other than my close family. And I have found myself doing some pretty strange things. So I've come out tonight in search of the moonlight, and I thought it would be quite fun to play you this tune.
Wow, impressive. And I don't think that Pete could have asked for a more beautiful introduction or prelude to his talk. So on that note, I'll introduce Pete Ianetta. He's the head of ecological food systems at the James Hutton Institute, and his research helps to implement sustainable agri-food and feed value chains. And he might explain what those are in his talk. His research interests are strongly focused on the multifunctional potential of legumes, and I'm sure he'll talk more about legumes too. So the floor, or the virtual floor, is yours, Pete.
Thank you, Mark, and Sue Lee for that amazing introduction. So it's great to have the opportunity to speak, so thank you to Seda, and I'm really happy to have so many concerned citizens here today as well, and I'll try and not lose you with rhetoric and cliches. I have a brief from Seda to be provocative, so I'll try to do that. I'll try to be provocative politely. And the conversation here is about soil and growth. In this conversation, there's an obvious focus on maps, on mapping and landscapes. And here I'll refer to the term landscapes mainly as a metaphor, exploring different, what I call points of entry towards more ecological design, especially for sustainable food and feed systems. I have quite a strong reference point, and I will advocate very strongly for homegrown legumes. And I present legumes as a vehicle by which we may travel our landscape, improve our awareness of soil, of ecosystem functions, of geochemical cycling, but more importantly, to deliver sustainable land management, food, as well as feed systems. Now, legume use, like tree use in non-cropped areas, can serve as an indicator of sustainable operations. And I hope this conversation, will be positioned with respect to future value chains, not supply chains, value chains, and that the businesses that will emerge from the crisis that we are facing will help us deal with the challenges quite well. We'll be taking this conversation forward with a view to, I hope, repositioning our industrialized food systems. So I'm going to start with some conclusions, not recommendations. Recommendations will come at the end. Our pathway to net zero emissions will require deep cuts across all sectors, and particularly, of course, significant greenhouse gas removals by land use sectors. The soil and what we grow on it will be vitally important for greenhouse gas mitigation and co-benefits to safeguard soil function, crop production, but also human and farm animal health. So the land use sector is set to play a critical role in delivering net zero emissions, but there's much more research and innovation that's necessary to deliver the necessary capacities on the ground, in my opinion. So this is where the real battleground is. It's the route towards zero carbon emissions, healthy environment, healthy people. So one of my first recommendations is to improve public experience, awareness, perception, and understanding of their place in ecological systems. And many members of the public I meet are very, very well informed. And many policymakers are too, but I still meet many who are not. It was, I think, Satchel Louis Armstrong who said, if you have to ask what it is, I won't be able to explain it to you. He was, of course, talking about jazz. But I'm mindful of results of sociologists who say that it's far more difficult to get adults to change than it is children, in that children, young people who experience positive emotional experiences around ecosystems, food, biodiversity, are far more likely to make informed decisions as adults. So during my talk, I'll be posing many questions, and I hope questions will appear. Your answers will appear in the Q&A. But what is the public's general awareness of ecosystem function, soil function, agriculture, the impact of their dietary choice on the environment? What is the nature of the general public's positive experience of these factors? What do they really know of crop systems or managed systems? How do the public perceive plants, crops? And even if the public are able to perceive the existential threats that we face, how do they have the freedom to operate, to mitigate and adapt their consumption choices? They're quite often passive in this process. I'm going to start talking a little really about what is a legume. It still amazes me that productive systems are productive because of the nitrogen that we put into those systems. And before we had synthetic fertilizers, legumes were the plant of choice to do that. Their main point of difference is their capacity to fix nitrogen naturally from the air. They can take nitrogen from the air, and they can make that atmospheric nitrogen biologically useful. And that nitrogen, excessive amounts of nitrogen are as much of a threat as carbon loss. And are we too distracted perhaps by carbon footprint mitigation? Not that it shouldn't be dealt with. It should be dealt with, and it should be dealt with alongside many of the other challenges that we face. So, I would propose that we need to conceive legumes, plants, and crops generally as net system givers, that they're not just there for removal of yield. If you can accept that concept, how you manage systems then becomes very different. And I would argue that the extent to which you're using legumes, like the extent to which you're using trees, are indicator of how well you might be managing your ecosystem. Now, legumes take many forms. There are ones that you might be familiar with, grain legumes. They're the peas and beans. They're harvested as dried grains, but they can also be harvested as vegetables. There are forage legumes that we know feed animals, but they can also be used as understories to cash crops or as cover crops to protect the soil. All of those can filter down to be manures. Manures have various forms: living manures, green manures, brown manures. So there are actually woody legumes as well, like gorse and broom. And some of them now are being treated to extract the protein to make food. But they can be used as bedding for animals, and they have been used as manures as well. There's a lot of innovation going on around legumes. And, they are extraordinary plants. There's very little for me not to like about them. They can help pollinators, beneficial insects. They can help diversify crop systems. We have crop systems at the moment that are highly polarized. I'll come on to that a little later. And there are, if we can diversify those crop systems by using more different plants, they can act as biocontrol agents. They can protect soil function, soil qualities. They can give nitrogen to other plants in the system. They can help liberate soil phosphorus, which is another mineral that's in short supply for production. And they offer nutritious food and feed. So with that in mind, before synthetic nitrogen fertilizers came along, they were the main way to get nitrogen into productive and resilient crop system. Looking around at some of my farmers, the ones that I see farming best, fully understand that relation between soil function, plant fitness, and they operate to minimize their inputs. A truly ecological approach. Yield is not at the center of their operations. It is soil function that's at the center of their operations. They're also very aware that excessive levels of nitrogen can damage crop performance and soil function. We can't keep applying mineral fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen in the way that we are. Yield is not the most important goal. It is farmers, at least economically speaking, gross margins. There are other leading lights in the farming community who are also soil and minimum input focused. And I think of systems where people have used alley cropping, running trees between their fields, quite narrow fields at times, using sometimes nitrogen fixing trees like alder in combination with nitrogen hungry trees like walnut. Essentially, these design features are using intercropping. They're using mixtures of plants in the same field or the same land area at the same time, minimizing inputs, maximizing soil function, and controlling disease. I'm hoping there'll be some soil specialists out there. I'm aware that there's a nitrate time bomb, that there are levels of nitrogen in the soil have really reached very high levels. It started around the introduction of synthetic fertilizers around about 1950s, 1960s. And that's led to an accumulation in some parts of Europe of up to 4,500 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. I don't know what it is in Scotland, but I do know there are producers of various goods in Scotland that are having to strip the nitrogen out of their water before they make the products. And maybe somebody else could tell me what is the state of the nitrogen level in the Vados layer in many parts of Scotland. The Vados layer being that layer between the soil surface and the bedrock. That nitrate we've added, it hasn't gone. Much of it is sitting in the soil and leaching out very slowly over time. That can leach into waterways. Added to climate change, it can cause deoxygenation of coastal zones. So we should be managing really our soils to curtail those risks. There are also, of course, other threats as well we must deal with, as well as soil function. But the costs of poor dietary choice are enormous. Diabetes is becoming a huge cost. There's a direct healthcare cost, and there's a productivity loss as well. So I think we have, by focusing on soil and actually soil functions, I see that as a means to address many of the things we're challenged with in one go. And Sally, if you could perhaps put up the map of the pea and bean growing in Scotland. I'm not using a lot of maps, but the green here shows pea cropping, and the brown dots show where bean cropping. Now, these are peas and beans cropped mainly for animals. I could show you the maps of pea and bean cropping for humans, but there wouldn't be very many dots. The fact is that in Scotland at the moment, grain legume covers such as peas and beans account for about 1% of the arable landscape, and that's not very much. You know, ecologically, with my agroecological hat on, I'd like to see 15% pea and bean cover. In fact, I'd like to see 25%, but that's actually very difficult with peas and beans. We need more in different legumes, and we don't have a breeding program for legumes in Scotland at all, and we can only perhaps select legumes from other areas to diversify the range that we have. But nevertheless, you know, the amount of grain legume cover is extremely low, and if we look at the pea rotation, we can see that they're very different from the bean rotations. There's more grass in the pea-based rotations, and I would say that the pea-based rotations have less pesticide going into them, probably because of the increased grass cover. Bean rotations tend to be a lot more intensive, but most of these peas and beans are not making their way to human food consumption. And in fact, only 4% of what we produce in Scotland makes its way for food. So thanks, Ali. You could take that down now if you wish. So we need a solution. I'm going to watch my time. I'll have a timer going here. We need a solution really to eliminate all the challenges and safeguard soil, but certainly a legume-based farming system are critical. Get legumes into rotations, intercrop them, get soil pH right, use precision agriculture, develop improved varieties. These are all critical approaches, to deal with that. We need to use better use of forage legumes in arable systems, or we need to use actually more forage legumes in the pasture systems as well. It's a mystery to me why more forage legumes, that's the clovers and such like, are not used. There's some great farmers out there doing minimal soil disruption to stabilize function, minimal fertilizer applications using grass and clover in combination, but actually not enough for doing that. And actually, when we look for information on how much legumes are being used in this dominant part of the Scottish agricultural landscape, we can't find that information because it's recorded simply as grass. So the current paradigms raise questions about how we've industrialized our food system. And we have to be absolutely clear here that the demise of legumes in Scotland and across Europe preceded synthetic fertilizer, starting about the 1900s. So I feel that the lack of reliance on legumes has come about through industrialization, and we need to reindustrialize our systems. We need to look towards intercropping. We look to landscape features to avoid diffuse pollution, and ask where are silvo-arable systems in Scotland and where are the silvo-pastoral systems in Scotland. So we have paradox, we have problems, we have puzzle, the 3 Ps as I call them. We have legume-supported food and feed systems in Scotland, but they're not homegrown, largely. So our benefits of legumes are forfeited. The problems mainly persist beyond the farm gate. And maybe if we want to protect soil and preserve it, we should be looking actually beyond the farm gate. And how might we deal with this complex series of local and global challenges? I think if we go straight to soil, we're at risk of missing the point. We have an opportunity here to solve numerous things at once: overconsumption, pollution, health, well-being costs, biodiversity loss, grain legume import dependency, greenhouse gas costs. So, second point I'd like to make is where are the truly joined up policies which will serve the well-being of soil, environment, biodiversity and citizens? Plant protein plan. I could go into a lot of details about this, but I think that the main point I wish to mention is that it's seen as an animal feed self-sufficiency plan. This in itself, reducing imports from ex-rainforest areas, Cerrado, South America, great. But there are other problems to deal with as well. And simply dealing with food import dependency is insufficient. So I would say we need a food system plan. Looking to Scotland, we've got particular challenges. We have particular industries that bring in, I think now it's approaching almost 12 billion in tax revenues. And as an agroecologist, I have to ask myself, how can I get biodiversity and legumes into a barley-dominated feed, not food, feed system? Half of that barley is for brewing beer and whiskey, the other half is for animal feed. We have other dominant industries that fortunately do take, are happy to take legumes, such as fish farming. Fish farming is 70% of the feed in a fish farm, a salmon farm, can take vegetable protein. They needn't be imported. If we were to crop legumes for aquaculture, it would have to happen on about 12% of our arable land. So, but we don't have the processing infrastructure. I've mentioned that we don't have breeding. And so we really need to be focusing more on innovation, and particularly innovation outside the farm gate, and looking towards key players, I think, to step up here and create the pool for the products, whether legumes or trees, to ensure that the landscape changes that need to happen, do happen. Systems to better serve value chains for a future that ensures ecosystem functions, safe geochemical cycling, and citizens' health, and that soil and what we grow on it are the vehicles to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Pete. There were a couple of moments towards the end where your sound faded in and out, but I'm going to ask Sally to put up your final slide, your synthesis slide with the 3 points that you prepared before, so that the audience can have a look at that. So Pete, there we are. There's a grey box over the bottom text for us, but there were 3 points that Pete used in his wrap-up just a minute ago, that are also reflected on these slides. So people can have a look at that. And at the same time, Gloria, we had 2 questions as polls prepared before. One of them was to ask whether folk in the audience were actually aware of the potential of legumes to lower our carbon footprint. And the second question was, so folk in the audience, you can just click yes or no on your screen right now. And the second question that we have is whether for resowing improved grasslands in Scotland, whether there should actually be an obligation to have a clover mix included in that grassland, so that there is no more pure grass monoculture, but that there's always clover included, and whether the audience thinks that this is a good idea or not. So we have the first poll on now, and I don't know whether the second poll will come up anytime soon. This is a bit of reflection on Pete's conversation, which is also the starting point for our 2 responders to reflect on what Pete has just been telling us. So our first responder is Bob Reid. He's the Development Director of Wildlands Limited, or Wildland Limited. That's the property company that's owned by Anders Poulsen, whom you've all heard of in the news, I'm sure. Bob has an extensive experience in many aspects of rural development in Scotland, also before he joined Wildland Limited. So Bob, would you like to turn your camera on and just use about 5 minutes to respond to Pete's talk just now?
Oh, I'm assuming everybody can hear me, and I will say good afternoon to everybody. And the first thing I should probably say is thank you very much, Pete. That was really quite challenging. It reminded me of earlier days, in my earlier days, when I used to get my ears boxed by a certain Drennan Watson advocating the fact that one of the best crops we could grow in Scotland was soft fruit. And in those days, though, the agenda was not so much environmental concerns, but more our Scottish health concerns and the state of the Scottish diet. But the number of times I've had that lecture over the years is quite considerable. Anyway, I'm going to jump as a response to a sort of kind of completely different but parallel view. Gail has mixed up the backgrounds, our expertise quite considerably. And you know, rather than me coming in here as a soil science, I come in at the kind of complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is about kind of macro scale land management and policy. And as we progressed towards the conference happening, there was a couple of maps that crossed my desk that one from a century ago, or more than a century ago, 150 years ago, and one from today, that seemed to illustrate the kind of wider issues we face particularly well. So could I have that first of those slides up on the screen? And I will explain, or try to explain. And I came across this slide as an illustration from the Betty Hill Museum in Betty Hill on the North Coast. And it was an illustration of where the cleared settlements were along the Neva. And this is the red line that is on that map, and this map is probably over a century old at least. The red line illustrates the catchment of the River Neva as it heads north and eventually meets the estuary of at Betty Hill. And you can see all the settlements there, and predominantly the thing I observed, and I'd never really crossed my mind before in terms of the wider debates, was the fact that they were, of course, in the lowland effectively along the riverbank and along the lost shore rather than the uplands. And at this point I go tangential because some of you will know that I've spent 40 odd years, nearly 44 years now, as a town planner working in Scotland, town and country planner. And this immediately put me back 44 years to the days when I started planning in West Central Scotland. My first job as a kind of strategic planner in Glasgow, working on Easterhouse, which couldn't be further away from the subject of this particular map. But it's the hatched areas that struck me as interesting because as a young planner, we were accustomed to what we now call the old plan maps, the town maps. One of the categories you'd see mapped on virtually every piece of planning work 50 years ago was land over 600 feet. And that land over 600 feet comprises, it's not very high, 200 meters metrically, comprises a great deal of Scotland, and as a soil type is increasingly going to be important in terms of certainly the wider ecological and environmental agenda. But it was suddenly seeing a map which was pulled together to illustrate the clearances with that piece of sound planning going back that long. And me sort of recalling that we used to, as planners, policymakers, we used to know where all this land was with soils that were important and vulnerable in this area of land called over 600. We've stopped doing that. Some of you can see that long, you can all see that very, very long, skinny salient of highland going up the Avoyne Peninsula between Loch Hope and Loch Erebol on the centre of the top of Scotland. Well, if I can go to my second map, you will see my point, I think, I'm hoping, in that this is a contemporary map pulled together as part of the effort to protect all those grey areas. And those grey areas on this particular map are the areas of deep peat that are at the heart of the bid to UNESCO to become a new World Heritage Site that covers the whole of this area in the north of Scotland. It happens to be illustrating one of the conundrums I have, that it's not just that particular wind farm that's illustrated there. There are 5 of them that all join together like jigsaw puzzles on that axis, right at the centre of this candidate World Heritage Site, that are causing me some concerns because of the scale of the intervention they will make into this protected peatland. And I just step back and reflect that if I look at that north coast of Scotland, at the right hand side just off the map we had Dounreay, and at the left hand side at the top of the map any summer when I'm working up there, still we hear the bombing and the live firing ranges of Cape Wrath. But in between, there was this candidate area that first crossed my planning desk as that 44 years ago, as the place that Terry Wogan was trying to plant trees. Today, I'm involved in trying to make sure we push this forward as a candidate and eventually a fully fledged World Heritage Site. And yet the controversy and the conundrums at the heart of all that never seem to go away. The top left-hand part of that has a rocket proposal that we are looking at and we're courting a lot of controversy about. This wind farm runs out up the centre of it. Okay. And these arguments about how we use these areas, how we look after these areas, just doesn't seem to go away. Great. So,
thanks.
I was going to say two more words in that context. 2 more words is fine. In that context, all I was going to say is that this is going to be familiar territory for all of us going forward.
Excellent. Thank you for that sort of spatial planning perspective of things. And then I'd like to invite Willie McGee to give his reflections to Pete's talk. Willie is a forester who's worked in community forestry and ecological restoration in Scotland since the 1990s. He's a member of the Forestry Policy Group, and he's also an active forest manager. Willie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I seem to be a little low down here. I'm sitting on a couch with a high table in front of me. Evening all. I am going to do a trot through a topic which has just been mentioned by Bob and make comment on some of the stuff that Pete was talking about. And I'd also like to thank Pete for his talk. And my topic is forestry and soil carbon. Now, I think as many of you know, we are in a new age of afforestation. So the Scottish Government, in their drive for net zero by 2045, have announced increasing year-on-year forestry targets. So we were sub 10,000 hectares a year 10 years ago, then we made it to 12. Now we've got a target of 15,000 hectares. For anybody that doesn't know, a hectare is about a football pitch. And if you get 100 of them together, that's a square kilometre. So the government is committed to approximately 180 square kilometres a year. Well, unless I've got my maths wrong there. And a lot of the afforestation is happening in areas more in line with what Bob was talking about, and not so much, if at all, on the land that Pete was talking about. So the places that you would grow peas and beans, those are, I presume, grade 1 arable land, and the areas that Bob was talking about were in the uplands. Sally, could I get my first slide, please? So this afforestation, much of it is, that's lovely, that's Bob's. Much of this afforestation is, that's good, thank you, is being done to grow Sitka spruce. Our Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government, Fergus Ewing, he loves Sitka spruce. He's effectively in thrall, if you like, to the forest industry and the forestry sector because of the 25,000 jobs, £1 billion revenue that's quoted as being the value of the forestry sector. So these, we've gone back to the 1970s, essentially. For those of you who can remember the 70s and 80s, Bob referred to Terry Wogan. And this is what was happening. Ploughing, very intensive disturbance, a lot of carbon loss, either through the drying out of the peat or by the peat being washed into drains and down into our river system. So where's the best place to put trees if we're not going to do this thing in the uplands? Can I get my next slide, please, Sally? And this set of slides does two things. I'm sorry, they're quite little in terms of the writing, but the first, that one in green, that was produced for WEAG, Woodland Expansion Advisory Group to the Scottish Government in 2012, produced a report, where can we put all our trees? And you can see those areas in green. and they should correlate. They were produced by the Hutton Institute, and they should correlate with that next map of Scotland, which is WEAG 2011 in the purple, yellowy, blue. Phase 1, don't plant here. Phase 2, possibly. Phase 3, lovely. And the last map going to the right is Scotland 2020. The Hutton Reid did an analysis, and blow me, but it's completely changed in 10 years. And now all those areas of land that Pete has his beans and peas on, they're the best areas for planting. And this is one of the problems, because we have researchers, these were produced using models, and the models you parameterize by putting some variables in. Next slide, please. And the soil variables, well, what do we know about our soil and soil carbon in the uplands and planting trees? This is near Schiehallion. I manage a piece of ground next to this, and we don't have to look at it in any huge amount of detail, but you can see that this is quite a complicated little map, and it was done by the Forestry Commission when they were the Forestry Commission, now Forestry and Land Scotland. And then if we can have the next map, please. What you do, this is the Hutton soil 1 to 250,000 at a Scotland scale. You can see that you move from something that is relatively fine-grained into this very broad brush, quite impressionistic painting. Yeah, so we've got some issues. We don't know where all the soil carbon is. We know we're not supposed to be planting on the deep peats, but it happens by mistake. What can we do about it? Well, the Scottish Forestry, the regulators, have it within their gift to produce new cultivation guidance, and it would effectively prevent ploughing in the uplands, but the scientists can't agree, and it's a kind of watch this space. So if you go to the Forest Policy Group website, then you'll see some of our papers about the 1970s flared trousers and ploughing making a comeback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Willie. And I think our three speakers so far have very nicely illustrated the challenges in our productive lowlands, the challenges in our uplands, the challenges in the squeezed middle. And so far, I think the solution that we have, or that's been presented in more detail, is thinking about legumes. I'm hoping that after our first interlude, when the rest of the panel joins in, we will have a few more ideas about potential solutions, and then a lively discussion about which solutions are best and how we can balance these different demands. But now it's time for our first interlude, entitled Mending the Basket. And this is a short animated film by Pantia and Kate Foster that shows how wetlands are valued across the world, and it focuses on the restoration work at the Gameshope blanket bog in the southern uplands, and pays tribute to the commitment needed to restore the peat bog.
How many about does he do a day, do you think?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. I've taken, after this year, I took a GPS of the point he's completed up to, and I've got a GPS of the point he's completed up to today, so I'm going to have a look at what, how much he's completed within the week. Let's figure that out.
Some must be easier than others.
Yeah, definitely. I've got all the nights kind of mapped out on GPS as well, so see where how long stretches he's doing.
Yoffie, come here. Yoffie, come on. It's not the moment to socialise. Yeah, there's quite many. I was going, all right, what's the colour of this peat then? And I got it down to a particular ink that was closest. And then I went, you know what the colour of peat is? Peat is the colour of peat. Why are you fucking around trying to make a match when you can literally stuff?
Great, welcome back everyone. And that was a very nice illustration of peatland restoration and one of the solutions to improve our soils, or at least some of our soils, the soil functions. Could we have the results of the two polls that we did before we had the respondents? Could we get those on the screen, please? So about 50-50 for being aware about legumes before the conversation. So at least half of you learned something new, which is always good. And should it become an obligation to have clover in there? Lots of people think yes. Some don't quite oversee all the consequences, and some think no. Right, thanks a lot for those answers. And we're now at the stage of our panel discussion. So there are three other very interesting people that I can introduce. Nikki Yoxall, who together with her husband produce beef from native and rare breed cattle, undertaking ecological restoration through their business, the Grampian Grazers. And I can attest that it's delicious beef that she does produce. And I knew that before she was invited to this panel, so it's not been a bribe of any sort. Nikki is also very active in all kinds of online discussions around sustainable food production, resource management, and is studying for a master's in her evening hours, I think. She's very busy. We also have Bob Rees, a professor at SRUC, a professor of agriculture and climate change and the head of the Carbon Management Centre. And his research focuses on greenhouse emissions, nutrient cycling in Scotland, but also beyond. And finally, we have Mats Fischer-Muller, who arrived from Denmark in Scotland not too long ago. He's currently a professor of food policy at Scotland's Rural College, and previously he's been a food policy advisor to the Danish government, and I understand he's made some, or contributed to some quite dramatic changes in their government policy. So it'll be interesting to see what he can do in Scotland in the next few years. As a first question to our new panelists, sort of an open question, but we've learned about a lot of the challenges, and I was wondering what you would see as solutions to prevent further negative impacts and to restore soil functions for future generations. And let's start with Nikki and then follow on to Bob and Mats.
Thanks, Mark. I was reflecting on something that Pete said in his opening presentation, and he asked the question, how do we include legumes in a barley dominated feed system? And my immediate response is that we need to change the system. And I think what's quite interesting is that a lot of the conversation and discussion exists within an idea of sustaining potentially the current paradigm. And obviously we have to think about how that can change going forward. I think what is helpful, and something that I found really helpful, is rather than thinking about systems and processes in mechanistic terms. And I was interested that somebody talked about, we talk about supply chains, and I think it was in the chat, there was a question about, we're talking about chains and we're talking about systems, and actually they're quite industrialized words that we apply to our ecology. And that is something that I think we need to reflect on. How do we look at the way that we integrate with our landscapes from an ecological point of view? And I don't know if Sally is able just to share a picture that I sent through, but I wanted to just give an example of how we're doing that. So hopefully it'll come up in a second, and you'll be able to see how we have applied agroforestry. So that basically means the integration of trees and woodland. And specifically when talking about livestock, that would be silvo pasture. So silvo being trees, pasture being pasture. And the way that this has actually enabled us to keep our cattle out all year round, regardless of the weather, even though we've had, nearly 3 foot of snow on the ground and -20 consistently over the last month. It enables us to ensure that our cattle don't have to have additional inputs. So mineral tubs and the like, and energy tubs that are given to animals, often have a base, particularly for energy tubs of palm oil and various soy derivatives. So utilizing trees in this way and integrating animals as part of the ecological landscape enables the functioning of our cattle as animals as part of that landscape, but also the trees to flourish thanks to the application, if you like, from these cattle of their manure onto these areas. And you might be able to see in the picture on the left hand side a white line in the background, and that's an electric fence. So we particularly apply mob grazing, which is a kind of catch-all phrase for how we move our cattle around. And this means that for the majority of the time, the majority of our land is being rested, and we're able to focus the animal impact in a very precise and measured way. And that means that when the soil isn't being disturbed, the soil is able to recover. And I would like to think that our approach is what I would term regenerative. And that means for us particularly that this idea of year-round cover, so no bare soil, and just thinking back to the lovely animation and the film that we just saw, this idea of bare soil can really be of concern. However, if we apply this approach and we think about changing that system that Pete talked about, actually our feed system could be one that is integrated with an ecology where our animals are fed pasture only. So all they're eating is grass, and the other diverse benefits of a mixed sward. There was a question in the Q&A about what are the other benefits of vetches, vetchlings and other legumes. And research tells us that will increase particularly insect biomass and biodiversity.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, Nikki, and move on.
Yeah.
But that's a very good introduction to a potential, or one of the solutions that we can use. I want to pass on to Bob Rees.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to Pete for that sort of thought-provoking talk at the start. I just want to take us back to the climate change emergency and our response to that, because really this is what frames a lot of our discussions. And I think one thing that's very clear from the sort of policy framework that's been set in response to this emergency is that status quo is not going to be possible in our environment, the landscape, over the next few decades. We're going to have to see major changes because the land use sector is going to be responsible for delivering some of the solutions to the climate change emergency that we face. And I think Pete outlined very nicely the role that legumes can contribute to this, but it is a lot wider than that. So our whole farming systems have to be transformed in order to reduce the carbon emissions that come from them. Agriculture is quite a significant source of greenhouse gases to our environment. And by 2050, it's accepted that agriculture will be one of the largest sources, because it's one of the sources that we can't completely remove emissions from. So by 2050, the only two really significant sectors producing greenhouse gases will be agriculture and aviation. And the term net zero refers to the fact that we're going to have to offset those emissions from agriculture and aviation by carbon removals, most of which will come from the land use sector. So the other point is that in addition to transforming agriculture, and there's maybe lots of discussion we could have about the various things that we could do there, and let's say legumes are part of it, but there has to be a much broader approach. The other part of this is the carbon removals, and this is where soils are particularly important given their role in terms of carbon sequestration. But I think we do also have to be careful about carbon sequestration discussions, particularly in a place like Scotland. Scotland's soils have some of the richest stores of carbon anywhere in the world. Certainly in the European perspective, our soils have very high carbon, and getting more carbon into those soils can actually be quite difficult. I think one of the things that we have to be really sure about is that we don't lose carbon from our soils. We have to keep the carbon that we've got there. Things like peatland restoration are going to be able to lock up a bit more. The creation of woodlands obviously is going to be an important way of getting more carbon into them. But I think getting more carbon into soils without changing land use is quite challenging. And just my final point is that coming back to the legumes, one of the really important roles that legumes will play in helping reduce emissions in the land use sector will be through dietary change. So the Committee on Climate Change, who have helped the government model the pathway to net zero, are recommending that actually we can probably reduce emissions from the agriculture sector more through dietary change than we can through low carbon farming techniques. So I'll finish there, and I suspect Mads will probably want to pick up on the dietary change thing anyway, so that's probably a good place to stop.
Excellent. Over to Mads then.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely segue. Yeah, and thank you very much to Seda for having this debate. To be honest, I'm from Denmark and have been working in the Danish civil service and the Nordic governments for their civil services. And none of these countries have this holistic approach to land use change as I'm seeing here. So that's very positive. Sally, if I can have my one slide, that would be lovely. Because what I think is quite important is that we are talking about a limited resource, the land. And also we've seen that not all of the land here in Scotland can be used for all the purposes we want. And this just shows us, well, on the top left, this is what we're using the arable land for currently. All the red is for livestock feed. The yellow is for the drinks industry. Then we have other purposes, including housing. And then what's left, the green stuff, is what we ought to eat the most of. If we're looking at the bottom left, this is what constitutes one example of a planetary healthy diet that is good for, that will bring us towards what Bob Reid said, the Paris Climate Accord. We need to be in line with our climate targets, but also will reduce our dependency on artificial fertilizers. So this will bring us in harmony with nature and be able to feed a world with 9 billion people. And we can just see how much red is on the top graph and how little red is on the bottom. So we need to figure out how much of our land are we to use for livestock. And if we are to use a lot of the land for livestock, how should we produce it? Should it not be more like Nikki's livestock and less like much of the livestock we see at the moment? You can just remove the graph again. But 10% of the good farmland in Denmark, my native country, is used for food for direct human consumption, and only 1 to 2% here. And we do have different conditions, but we need to have a conversation about consumption change if we are to not, we can't do all the things we want with our land when it comes to providing ecosystem services without starting to also change what we're using the arable lands for. If that is also the best land for forestry, for carbon sequestration, and if, as Bob said, this sector will need to reduce, to like go in land use needs to sequester way more carbon. So we definitely need to change. And we can see that discussion is happening all around the world at the moment. It's globally, we are embracing the fact that change needs to come. When I was in the Danish government 6 years ago, this was such a difficult discussion. Nobody really dared to touch it. When I tried to press this to the minister's table, my superior said, well, we can't have this discussion. It's too dangerous. No politician will touch it. Now this is being discussed at high UN level, UN Food System Summit this year. So a lot of discussion is happening. Not too much here in Scotland yet, though, even though we have the worst diets in Europe, and we have perhaps the most perverse use of land when it comes to our farming system in Europe. So there's definitely a lot to do here, but we need to have a good conversation about what do we want Scotland to be? What do we want our lands to provide? And how can we include consumption change in this discussion? It also ties back to what Pete told us, because we need to eat more of the legumes that are so good for the soil, so good for the climate, but there just is no market for them at the moment. So it's not to say that's the main solution, but it's part of the solution as well.
Thank you, Mats. And so this idea of needing a vision is very interesting to me, because I've done quite a bit of research around land use visions for Scotland. But you also say we need to basically we need to understand and know that we should all eat more legumes. And there have been quite a few calls out here today already from the various experts that we have on the panel about the need for more societal understanding about the land system and the food system. So I was going to ask our panelists, and I don't really have a preference for who responds first. I mean, maybe even let's go back to Pete to respond first. In that, if we're going to raise this awareness, or need to raise this awareness, and Pete sort of said that maybe young people are the place to start, but how do we go about that? How do we raise a societal awareness so that there'll be more support for changes in the way land is managed, understanding of how the land is managed? And at the same time, a poll has popped up for the general audience to think about when young people should first think or learn about ecology and food systems. So there's something for the audience to answer, whilst maybe Pete, as the first one, reflects on awareness raising and education of food systems.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think I would probably emphasize informal education first, and just simply to allow children to experience a good food culture, and to develop positive emotional experiences around food and around good food. But wrapped up in that, we need transparency about the food that is being, or the environments that are being presented to the children as well, the food environment. So I do see the importance of accounting for the impact of food products becoming more important. The transparency across the value chains. It's there for organic products to an extent in terms of some form of certification, but we need the consumers, I think, need reassured that their consumption choices are achieving what they want them to achieve as well. But certainly going back to the original question about children, I would start off with good food experiences around, for them, whether it's a forest garden, whether it's going to a farm, a good farm, and just building up informal, positive emotional experience. I take that lead from the sociologists, and then slowly introduce the more formal education. About, my youngest is 9 years old, but he was aware of mycorrhiza and soil from when he was 3 or 4. He was drawing pictures of trees with mycorrhiza, but that's only because he was exposed to it through me.
Okay,
I'm lucky in that respect. Other parents deserve the same.
And I don't know, Nikki, what is your experience in communicating what you're doing to a general audience? Because in some ways it might be quite sort of niche what you're doing, and maybe a certain type of middle class, higher educated person who likes very nice beef would be attracted to what you're doing. But how do you reach a general audience for your activities and also your products?
Yeah, it's something that we struggle to to grapple with, because generally the types of people that buy our product are fairly well off, but something that we currently don't claim any subsidy where we are, but in expansion in the future we will be entitled to taking a subsidy, and the way that we want to use that is to directly reduce the price at the point of purchase for our customers. So if we've got X amount of money coming into subsidy, I want to be able to directly attribute that to X number of beef boxes, which then mean I can sell those to people who have less money to spend on food. I mean, alongside that, obviously I'm campaigning all the time to raise awareness that the price of food isn't the reason for food poverty. The reason for food poverty is structural inequalities and a massive social issue that I'm not going to get into now because we're primarily focusing on soil and growth. But I think we need to reflect on how we think about subsidy and how we directly apportion the income that farmers get as subsidy to ensuring that people who access food are able to do that at a price point that is inclusive, and that doesn't mean that basically the questions and the discussions that we're having are the preserve of the middle classes, because it's not fair.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. I don't know whether Mats has some experience from his work in Denmark.
Yeah, I have, and I think it's this question is very unique to United Kingdom. When I've been talking about food system transformation, the need to change in India, in Costa Rica, in many places around the world, and a lot of Europe, and uniquely to United Kingdom, I've heard this class bias against food, or this class argument against food system change. Well, isn't this hard on some people? And it might be, but it is, as Nikki says, it's partly a societal problem. Well, it isn't because food is too expensive. It's because the economic system in United Kingdom is crap compared to most of Europe, and very, very unequal. But there are fixes, and we should work with those fixes. We can definitely work from, for instance, public procurement on changing the supply chains that we need to embrace. We can work with making the good products healthier, and we can make the healthy, sustainable products more easily available. And there's a lot government could do in order to support that. At the moment, though, government is mostly supporting what we're already producing a lot of, which is meat and dairy, etc. So I think a lot of this is the debate we're also having in the rest of Europe, to redirect public funding towards the kind of change that we want to do, and to then work in the food environments where we can really create some food culture change. In Denmark, organics was a niche phenomenon 15 years ago. Now organics is growing mostly in the lower middle classes and in the rural areas. It's gone from niche to mass. We need to have that transition of the positive, cool, new, vibrant food culture with more Scottish produced plants, and bring it from niche to mass. And there are a ton of policy options available, but it's have to start with policymakers in the Scottish government recognizing the need for change. And I've been meeting policymakers who said, well, Scotland, is that not, we can only grow barley and meat, right? And if we're starting there, we just can't get anywhere. So we need to show that there are alternatives available, and then we need to build a movement towards those.
Well, that's a very powerful plea for different types of government intervention. I guess there could be questions around individual responsibilities and awareness raising, so that individuals make their own choices as sort of in combination with government policies. But looking at the time schedule, I think we're going to move on to our second interlude before we have our general Q&A session, and we can pick up on some of these points again in the Q&A. So I'm very pleased that Chris Powicki is here for the second conversation. I'm not quite sure, Chris, are you going to keep this up for all 6 of the conversations?
This is my second and sadly my final poem contribution.
Oh, the final one. I was hoping to be a regular for all 6 of them.
No, you get even better poets to come. I'm just the appetizer.
Don't sell yourself short. So you've written a poem around Flanders Moss, a national nature reserve outside of Stirling. can you tell us a bit about the process that led you to writing this poem before you read it out to us?
Yeah, well, actually, it was interesting because it was part of a project to involve the local community to get them to know the history of Flanders Moss more and also the ecology of it. It's a fragment now, a very small fragment of a much wider area of bogland and moss and peatland, which in the 18th century especially was carved up. I mean, peat was used and floated down the Forth to be used elsewhere. And the Flanders Moss remains. And it's got a sort of tower where you can, a viewing tower, and also a walkway around some of the moss. So it's quite a popular place to go. I went there yesterday actually just to refresh my memory of it as my daily exercise. I was fascinated by it as a poem, as a place, I think for two reasons. A, because it's not iconic Scottish landscape. It's not lochs, it's not forests, it's not big mountains. It's flat, it's mossy, it's huge or scrubbed birch and heather and so on. So it's different to what we normally think of as an iconic Scottish landscape. And it also interests me because I think it, as a question, it involves a different question from land use, but one that's tied with land use. And that's the one that I think poets and writers and other artists think about, is what does the land actually mean? What does it mean to us? And so I think Flanders Moss is interesting because it challenges us in many ways and fascinates.
We look
So
forward
I'll read the poem now. Flanders Moss. Flat land, deep land. Nothing higher than scrub birch between you and those miles away mountains, heat hazed and blue in the distance. Even the air feels empty, cleansed. So you look down through the wind-shivered seed heads of hare's tail bog cotton to shallow, beetle-furrowed pools, fringed by quaggy, almost islands of deer grass and heather still to bloom, and the sheer living green of the moss itself, Papillosum, Magellanicum, Imbricatum, infinite low rise of sphagnum, moth ground and adder cradle, intricate and crowded as the city, and all of it floating on 7,000 years of peat, the cool, rich stuff of death, oozing its thick, milky mud, just a step, just a thought away. Soft land, dark land, earth on the verge of becoming water, earth you could drown in. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So that gives a real tangible sense of being in a bog and also of the bog's history, which, well, I certainly appreciated very much. And thanks for your second appearance with us, Chris. And also, thanks for bringing us right back onto time, because we are right on schedule to start our Q&A. The slight challenge for me is now to figure out which questions in the Q&A to pick up. So I'm pretty sure I was supposed to get a queue in my sideline chat, but I can't find it right now. So we have about 20-25 minutes, and hopefully these questions will focus around things that have been mentioned in the Q&A chat session here. But we'll see, maybe the panel will also digress a bit. Could all the panelists turn their cameras on again so that we can see you all? And I'm meanwhile desperately trying to scroll to see whether there is a couple of questions, right? So there are some questions around cattle rearing and the future of cattle rearing in Scotland, and sort of the tensions with that, and So the general knowledge that animal protein is not the most efficient way to use land, and the sort of negative climate implications of cattle. So the most obvious person who must have thought about this loads is Nikki, but I suspect that Bob Rees will also have a clear idea about the future of cattle and sort of beef and sheep in Scotland. So I'll leave it between Bob Rees and Nikki to fight off who wants to address that tension first.
Well, I think I just wanted to jump on the back of what you were, a comment you made there, Mark, about efficiency, and would just like to, I haven't got it to hand now, but there's some really interesting research that's come out of Rothamsted that actually takes into account nutrient index and nutrient density of food. So I just think it's important that we don't consider all land equal. So the side of a mountain isn't the same as lowland arable land, and so if we take into account nutrient density of food, then actually upland lamb can be far more efficient in terms of global warming potential than arable crops, and we can also, and so both in terms of the global warming potential in terms of how that relates to nutrient density, but also how then that relates to global warming potential, nutrient density, and arable land use equivalencies. So I think we just have to be very clear that it's not this carrot and this beef are equal, because actually it's a very complex picture. So the way that we maximize sort of calorie output is not the same as maximizing nutrient output. So these are very complex issues that actually I think we can't just look at in terms of productivity, but also then what we are getting back. And I think it was mentioned before that that legumes, for example, are contributing to sustainability and to soil health, and I very much view and believe and can see the results that my cattle are doing the same thing. So we have to maybe think not just about what are we getting off and out of the land and this extractive idea, but actually what's going back in as well. So I'll hand over to Bob, who probably wants to come in and add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. So I think I'd come back to my point about the dramatic need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland and the UK. And I guess one of the ways you would start by looking at that would be looking at the food products that have the highest intensity of emissions. And unfortunately, the products that have the highest intensity of emissions are the animal products, and particularly the ruminant livestock. So reducing our consumption of ruminant livestock would make a difference to our greenhouse gas emissions. But it's not only that. If you look at WHO guidelines for a healthy diet, we eat about twice as much protein as is healthy for us. So we could achieve not only greenhouse gas mitigation targets, but improved health outcomes, not by removing meat from diets. I mean, there'd be opportunities to eat better meat, but by reducing it. And I think we sometimes forget how much meat in our diet has increased in recent decades in response to freely available, cheap nitrogen inputs. I think if we valued these things a bit more, there would be an opportunity to align healthy dietary outcomes with improved sort of planetary environmental outcomes, and have benefits for the soil as well.
Great. There's another question around communities, and especially rural communities, and their role within this transition that we're talking about. So I know that certainly for woodlands and woodland planting, there's a lot of community woodland activity, and I guess Nikki probably is part of a rural community. I don't know whether in Denmark rural agricultural communities were considered in the food revolution. So I don't know. I mean, Willie, do you want to start off with an idea about community forestry and how that can link into the transitions we need to make?
I think that, I mean, we kind of haven't gone big on land ownership, but certainly in Scotland, the government is making an effort. You could call it slightly tokenistic because of the amount of money that's going in. And what we tend to do is we give communities money from the Scottish Land Fund so that they can buy government forests. So there's a sort of circularity in there. But what we're finding is that when local people get their hands on land, they tend to have quite an exciting scattergun approach to development. So not so much on crops, but certainly in housing, in alternative timber products, in enterprises, small scale local enterprises. So these things are, they're quite exciting. However, we're not giving community access to sufficient land, I don't think, and usually it's an old Sitka spruce forest that's stuck somewhere in the North Highlands. And with agriculture, I think there's quite a big an exciting potential to get communities to look at agriculture and forestry and land use in general in an integrated way. Because the problem, all our discussions here are about our own polarized sectors. So farmers are the obvious people to be foresters as well, produce food and trees. And foresters should be looking at ways of getting new entrant farmers in to areas of land, like the better growing and low-lying land. However, our politicians get lobbied by sectoral interests whose, they either want Sitka spruce, or they want beef, or they want sheep, or they, so we can, and so it's very difficult for communities to kind of get, there's not a lot of space in there.
Mats, is that something that you recognize from Denmark, or do you have a more integrated approach to involving local rural communities in these types of solutions in food systems?
Yeah, well, to be honest, Denmark is so small, and people are mostly living in the Copenhagen area, in Aarhus, and in a very short. Well, you can always come to one of the major two cities in Denmark within a 1.5 hour drive. So you never feel very, very rural. So the discussions about land use are usually not that very closely linked to the setting. I think we can take more inspiration from Norway, Sweden, Finland, countries that are more similarly populated with large chunks of the population in the rural areas. But to be honest, I think what is crucial in Denmark and in most of the countries is to show that there is a profitable alternative. As we saw in the chat, I was just trying to follow. Well, we need to make sure that people can make a living from the soils, from the land. And to be honest, most of the Scottish farm businesses does not make much money when you are taking away the subsidies, the benefits from the common agricultural policies. Well, these will probably fall. So we need to rethink how we are valuing the lands, and hopefully, I would say, much of the kind of the reforesting, we need much of the agroforestry, we need much of the biodiversity we need to recreate in the highlands will create and have the potential to create a lot of new jobs. So it's not as though farming is the only way you can make money when you're living in the countryside. We need to come away from that romanticized vision of farming and figure out how can we actually make money in the countryside and in the landscape. Have an honest conversation about that. There are alternatives. We can sell the ecosystem services way better than by having sheep graze our
so
hills.
That links nicely to another question that was raised in the Q&A. And so for some of these changes in land businesses, it also requires a different skill set from the land managers than the ones that they've been traditionally trained in. So the forester, the farmer, and so on. And the question is around how can we make sure that SRUC or other educational organizations within Scotland provide the relevant training and advice to allow future rural businesses or business leaders to, not just farmers and foresters, or the hybrid solution that comes out of this, to address the biodiversity and climate change challenges and to embrace this innovation. So I'm wondering between, well, we got yourself, Pete, and Bob here representing SRUC. So, or well, I guess Pete, the James Hutton Institute, but collaborating, I'm sure, with some of the educational institutions. So how do you think you can make sure that the next generation of graduates has the skill set to think more holistically and in a more integrated way around land management?
Yeah, it's a great question and a really important one. And I think skills training area is one that we're looking at really hard at the moment. And it's not just about integration, it's about development of new technologies, new approaches to farming. As I said earlier, I think our approach to landscape management is going to have to be revolutionized in the coming decades. And that means reskilling the rural populations. And I think the way to do that is through a joined up approach between civil society and our institutions, linkage between institutions, which already work very well in Scotland. I mean, Pete and I have worked for many years together, and with other colleagues from James Hutton. I think it's not a single institution response. It's a multiple institution, multiple societal response that we need to this, and it's a big challenge.
If I am to say,
maybe I could just add to that.
Yeah, sure.
So sorry, Matt. Yeah, I mean, SRUC of course teach. Hutton does teach in a different sort of way, but from my perspective, I would like to see more land managers, farmers trained in agroecological principles. It's one thing to be trained in organic, or trained in integrated farming, or trained in conventional intensive farming. But I want to make a distinction between that technical training and the development of an agroecological mindset. And I'm not sure that is always taught. It's a philosophical frame of mind, really, but it's still quite critical. But anyway, Matt, sorry, over to you.
If I may, I also think we may have a tendency to overemphasize the amount of power research institutions in agriculture have over the system. When I started in the Danish Ministry of Food and Agriculture, I can remember we were planning like campaigns to get people to feel more attracted to food and farming jobs, because it was really hard to attract people to this sector. Then 10 years on, I was visiting an event on how do you do your own composting in the urban center of Copenhagen, and there were 350 people there, and I was among the 10% oldest, and I wasn't that old at the time. So to say, there is this huge change in the societal, in the discourse when it comes to land, food, and we actually just have to make sure that we are not standing in the way actively, government, universities, and we can tend to reinforce like the status quo. We are being asked by the government to answer the question, how can we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from conventional cattle farming? And we dutifully address that question, but it would be way better to just eat something different and have more of Niki's cows. And that's not what we are asked. So we should challenge the government when we are asked to answer the wrong questions. And then we should just not stand in the way of the next generation being way, way, way more systems critical than we can imagine. So hopefully, I'm very, very hopeful, to be honest.
So I think we've seen Niki as an example of leading the way as a younger generation, trying to do things differently. But I was wondering, Willie, from the forestry perspective, do you recognize some of these generational differences and also some of these barriers in formal training or opportunities for newer training for new generations of foresters?
Yeah, very much so. We've been very fortunate in the Forest Policy Group to be funded by the Pebble Trust to do some research on soil and soil carbon. And when we did a stakeholder analysis amongst foresters, it's generally the young guys who are most open, most alive to doing something different to that which they're doing now, and it tends to be a relatively predictable old rump who want to hang on to the production systems of the past, and I think that's the same in throughout the Scotland's rural areas. I've seen people running volunteering courses and training courses for rural skills based on forestry. And young people are, as Mad said, they're desperate to get engaged in it. It's just the mechanism to give them access, and that's the biggest hurdle is, you know, often their opportunities just aren't there to try and get them out. That's why things like, I mean, I think Pete touched on forest schools. You know, any exposure when people are young, you know, to forest schools or to good farming practices, to nice farms, as we see on Countryfile. And, you know, so yes, there is an appetite for it, Mark. Just it's trying to find ways of funneling that into a sector which is locked in, like agriculture, is locked into a paradigm, and it's trying to get that shift that Mads is talking about. You know, that thing that he's so eloquently sort of suggested we try and do.
And so one thing that Mads referred to, and I is the need for a vision, to know where we want to be able to get there. And that was something that was also sort of came up in the first conversation last week. But Charles Warren, towards the end, when he was summing up his thoughts, very eloquently put it, and I won't put it as nicely here, but it was sort of, do we need to have one single vision for future land use in Scotland, or for the future food systems in this case in Scotland? Or should we accept that there is space to have multiple different visions, and should we provide opportunities for these multiple different visions to thrive? And if so, how would that work for any of the panelists?
Can I jump in there, Mark? I think a lot of the questions that are being posed, the answer that we keep coming back to in my mind is about diversity. And I feel that there's a slight irony on the International Women's Day. I'm the only female on the panel, but we'll park that for now. But, you know, the diversity of thought, the diversity of bringing people together, the work that's being done. I know Davy McCracken is in the participants today. You know, the integrated land management teams at SIUC are looking at how to bring people together, and rather than just creating siloed thinking within the UHI, so University of Highlands and Islands, who I do continue to do some work with, have an integrated land management conference. Work that I'm doing with the Land Workers Alliance is looking to develop agroecological training, and it's all about creating diversity. We need diversity in our swards, we need diversity in our communities, we need diversity of thought, of voices. If we continue to keep thinking in foresters over here, or, you know, educators over there, or these people need to fix the problem, actually collaboration, co-creation are going to be the way that we get ourselves out of this. My fear is that we get to a point where suddenly actually all of this posturing about what we might do becomes irrelevant, because the world is burning and suddenly we're all desperate, and how are we going to get our food? We have to be emotionally mature enough to be able to see and recognize this now and act immediately. And it's not going to be addressed by, no offence to any of my fellow panel members, by pale, stale, male, industrialised approaches to systems, which is kind of where we are at the moment, and that's how we've got here. So I think we all have a responsibility to build diversity in at every level of education, in all of our communities, and when we don't see it, we need to be challenging it and asking for it to be more inclusive.
Excellent, thank you, Nikki. So, pale, still, and male, this is your chance to respond. Mats.
Yeah, it's not to say that pale, still, and male in this panel isn't a problem, but yeah, we were invited and dutifully wanted to contribute. I completely forgot what I was about to say in all of this introduction. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, vision. I think with the places that I know of where a vision has been important, do we need one vision? Do we need more than one vision? I'm not entirely sure. But just as an example, 10 male old white chefs made a manifesto 15 years ago in the Nordic countries, and we have taken it off our websites because it's so embarrassing today that 10 years ago you could have an all-male panel coming up with a vision. But that vision was not something that the government made. It was not something that had been through a big conversation. It was a splendid, new, crazy, outside the box vision for rethinking what food could be like in our countries. And that vision was perhaps kind of embraced by government, supported by government, but wasn't formulated by government. But it was big and strong and could bring a lot of energy that was people. We all want to do good for the world, and that vision showed us a way we could do it. And government worked on some bits of that vision to change things, but that vision mostly just catapulted and put all of the energy in the sector in one direction towards more sustainable and, to be honest, cool, nice, tasty foods. So having a vision about where we want to go does not have to then be the same as having a very, very detailed plan thought out by boring civil servants, but having a big vision about direction of travel and then let all flowers flourish and show a lot of ideas that can put us there. That's important. And I think that globally we have that vision with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accord. So we have like the overarching structure. We need to translate that to a Scottish context, and then we need to get everybody on board and then help people who want to go in the right direction.
Great. I'll pass on to Bob Reid first, because I missed him off my screen, so that's why I haven't been more actively encouraging his views. So I'll go to Bob first and then to Willie. But I know that Bob works for in Wildland, embraces a bold vision. So go ahead, Bob.
Well, as part of the prep for all of this, one of the things we had to do was to come forward with three kind of big questions, and I kind of confine that to one. And listening to all this debate and discussion, it was something that Nikki said about old, male, stale, grey, that I suddenly, cracky, that's me, and me big time. So, but I'm going back to my question, because listening to an awful lot of what's been said, whether it's to do with farming, economics, politics, land ownership, all of that range of things, the question I posed going back is that quite often we look at problems and issues and try to tackle problems and issues at the problem level. And what we never do, or quite often don't do, is to step back and try and think, well, aren't those problems the symptom of something kind of bigger? And that we collectively need to look at those problems and think, is there something wrong in the way all of this is working? So, for instance, we might know of farming issues elsewhere in the world and farming issues here, but never think that, seriously about challenging world trade in food to the extent that we might need to do so to try and start to, approach a different way of looking at this, and something that kind of brought about an idea that food should be what you can grow where you live, and enforce that and simply live by that might have a huge impact on what is grown and how we eat. And that ultimately goes back to being a kind of product of how we tackle economics. These are huge, huge issues when you start to look at them and break them down in that manner. So all I would say is keep the systems thinking alive. And along with several of I'll just add one more sort of example to that. Having worked most of my career, certainly the last 30 years in the northeast of Scotland, it's pretty hard to see the northeast of Scotland as being anything else other than an energy city, primarily focused on energy. And yet, previously, of course, it was the centre of effectively a primary, it was a market town at the centre of a very, very vast primary industry, paper, wood, meat, and so on. So we've changed almost entirely now to being dependent totally on petroleum engineers. And so the question which comes right back to the Aberdeen universities and the Robert Gordon universities, what do we do with, why are we still accepting students in this day and age to study petroleum engineering? We should be sending them to MADS and getting them to learn about agricultural and economic systems for the future of the planet. So it's about looking at how we get to that overarching level, and to a degree, I think, become slightly directive in how we tackle those big system issues. And I'll shut up now and be the old stale grey male that Nikki has labelled me as.
Okay, Willie, you also had your hand up to respond to the vision question.
Yeah, I think that it's great having visions, and it's great when you've got somebody who's got the energy and the passion, as Mats has, in presenting it. The problem we have is we've got politicians and senior civil servants who are very adept at capturing our words and firing them back at us. And we look at it and we go, there is the new vision for our land. And, you know, we need to have the thinking that Mats was talking about, which unpicks the processes that we've got. There was one, just a very quick example, in soil, there is no soil carbon legislation in Scotland. The only legislation that applies to Scotland is in relation to water. And it's because one of, I think it was a Hutton researcher, they were looking at the socio political context. They said that Scotland and the UK basically don't like legislating to make things better. They like the voluntary principle, and I think that we need. Yeah. So my take home would be, if we can get Mats to get a Scottish accent and we can get him in front of people and give him a slightly different name, then we're going to have a, you know, we can push our vision.
Okay, great. Thanks, Willie. We're reaching the end of today's conversation. I think we're going to manage to complete nicely on time, but before we have our coda, our closing artistic contribution, I'd like to ask each of today's contributors to just give a short, and I want to emphasize short, sort of 2 to 3 sentence reflection, sharing your your thoughts or your insights from today's conversation. And I suggest we do it sort of in reverse order from the way that we started. So we'll give Pete the final word, and we'll start with Mats to give a very short reflection on the conversation today in a couple of sentences with very little notice.
Okay, so me now,
yes.
Without a Scottish accent, even though my kids are trying to teach me that 4 is not called 4 but 4. I'm really trying, but yeah, I think these conversations, also the one last week and the coming, I'm looking very much forward to them. I do believe that change is inevitable in this area. I can see that what was completely unthinkable 10 years ago is now the new normal in Denmark. I can see that when I designed new policies for dietary change, it was very much status quo, and now the Danish government is arguing for a 10-fold increase in legumes and a halving the meat consumption. So big change is coming everywhere else. I think the Scottish government wants to insulate itself a little bit from that, but I don't think it can. And I don't think after Brexit and after CAP that there'll be the money to support status quo. So change is coming, and we just need to prepare the next generation for what will inevitably come our way. And then all the good ideas that we have in this room will hopefully have a place once the policymakers just can't keep status quo being the norm. They need to change, and then our ideas will have a place. And I'll do my best to push as much as I can.
Excellent. Bob Rees.
Yeah, thanks. So I think today's discussions have been fascinating, and it shows there's lots of enthusiasm bubbling up here around this issue of land use and environment and climate change. The one thing I would say, just to finish off, is that Scotland and the UK are going to be the world's focus of attention later this year at the International Climate Conference in Glasgow, COP26. This is our opportunity to bring land use to the centre of those discussions, because land use is going to be critical in the discussions around solving the climate change and biodiversity problems. So let's hold on to these discussions and amplify them as the build up to that conference begins.
Thanks, Bob. Nikki.
I think the really important things is that soil is where it all starts, and so we have to take a ground up approach, and we have to learn our lessons from nature, where diversity enables abundance, and that's what we have to be pushing for. And I am concerned that the policy frameworks and direction isn't going to do the job we need it to. So let us take our lead from the soil and go from the ground up and keep pushing for change and keep pushing our expectations that we can, as Scotland, be world leaders on this. We shouldn't have to wait for people who basically are using the information we're giving them to make decisions. We just need to act on that and support small scale producers, local producers, farmers who are approaching things in an agroecological way and utilizing their regenerative principles to enable that growth.
Excellent, Nikki. You have a fan club on the chat, which is fun to see. Right, Willie, you're up next.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I feel a lot more positive about things, having listened to our speakers today. And the thing I didn't realise, which is the slight downside, is Mats's breakdown of what our agricultural products go for. I was one of those who had a kind of a naive beef and tatties and lots of stuff that we grow, we consume. But I generally feel positive because I do see so much enthusiasm and so many engaged people in the chat. So whilst I don't have anything specific other than to echo what Bob has said, that we do have an opportunity this year to put a case forward in terms of land use at COP26. If we get the opportunity, and we should try to try and influence government and to get something in there that changes opinions in the agricultural and land use sector.
Great. Bob Reid.
I had my say 5 minutes ago, Matt, so I'm going to keep it very, very short, and that's just to echo exactly everything that's been said about the importance of COP26. We're being asked at the moment whether or not Glenn Feshie could be on the tour of some of the visitors to come and see. And I think there's an awful lot of interest in that at the moment. So all I would say is go see and see what's happening.
Great. And then we end up back with Pete.
So thanks everybody for the comments. I'm glad it stimulated some debate. I would just say briefly that businesses are stepping up to this challenge of all sizes, which is great to see. And sustainability will be the new language of marketing. So and I hope there'll be multiple visions in the future. I wouldn't like to say one solution, but it's critical, of course, that the direction of travel is right, whatever vision is pursued. I see certainly science and knowledge systems as being pivotal for their independence to look at what's going on. And we need metrics. I'm going to pick up on something Willie said, which was he hinted at a soil directive or something like that. I personally would welcome that. Monitoring diversity, monitoring soil, monitoring greenhouse gases, looking at carbon accounting. We need the metrics to do that. And that's certainly where I hope science will be, and making sure that we've got the necessary data and knowledge base to ensure that the products are moving in the right direction.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. So on that note, it's time for our coda, the final artistic contribution. After that, I'll just end with some concluding and remarks thanking everyone and so on. But the real most important final contribution is the coda. It's a short film entitled King of the Wood. It was created during the first lockdown by a fiddle player, Ian Fraser, who wrote a tune, and his videographer son, Duncan, made a film about a tree that they often walk to as a family, and the importance of that tree as a survivor from previous landscapes and land use changes. So over to the King of the Wood. That's a very beautiful end to our conversation. Makes me realize how much I miss seeing lichen-covered trees during this lockdown period. That concludes our second conversation. All that remains is to thank our panelists, Pete, Bob, Willie, Mats, Bob again, Nikki, and also our contributing artists, Sue Lee, Pantia and Kate Foster, Chris Kowicki and Ian Fraser, and everyone who's contributed to the chat today, to the questions, to the back office as well, with getting all the slides up and prompting me with questions and so on. Also like to thank our partners who've helped us organise this, the James Hutton Institute, the Open University, Bella Caledonia, and our sponsors, the Pebble Trust and Wildland Limited. The conversation doesn't quite end. As you know, we do have 4 other conversations coming up, but also there's the possibility to continue communicating with each other and sharing your ideas in something that's called a Padlet document. And I think there's this slide coming up on the screen and a link that you can click in the chat possibly, and that will also be sent out to you later. But it's an online forum type of thing that is very intuitive and easy to use, where you can add your ideas. We'll also add the a screen or a readout of the chat and the questions and answers. So it has all the material together from the different conversations and allows you to contribute to those over the weeks ahead and in preparation for the next conversation. So it's a way of providing CEDA with more input for the final report that they're creating, and also for you to stay engaged with a wider conversation around the future of Scottish land use, or the vision. I'm getting tired after 2 hours of this, so apologies for that. I think that's just about it, other than to tell you that there are opportunities to still buy tickets for the future conversations if you don't have a season booking as it is, and that what we've been discussing today and the work on the Padlet will go out into a final report that will be sent to government and will also be shared with anyone who's bought a ticket. So you will receive documentation in a number of weeks' time summarizing the 6 conversations. And on that note, and 3 weeks, geez, there we go, 3 minutes over time. This is the end of the second conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. It was interesting and fun to chair, although I must admit that I'm pleased that I can now switch off my webcam. Hope to see many of you again in the future in different opportunities, and have a great evening.